Thank you, Martin, and thank you, Professor Ruth Kiraka. Very nice to see that we arrived at very good relationships and most of all, ideas about the future. One of the things that I think may have arisen, probably not overstated, is the ability of small and medium enterprises to integrate and speak with one voice on policy while retaining the market approach towards private sector entrepreneurship. However, that is a very big thing, but that's what Strathmore University Business School is all about. Today on Trade and Industry, I'd like to welcome you, Bwana Frank Matsat, as Martin calls you. You have been doing a lot of work in policy design, in restructuring trade environments, and I know you have a lot to tell us regarding that issue on improving African trade. What a wonderful moment to have you here, Frank, and it's wonderful to be your partner. Thank you. Please come in.
Well, look, thanks so much. And I'm really honored that you invited me this morning. Thanks so much. And yeah, my name is Frank Matsart, and I'm the CEO of Trademark East Africa. And I guess I've been the CEO of Trademark now since the beginning. So that's almost 12 years, which is quite a milestone for me. But, you know, thanks so much. Maybe just to say a little bit, first of all, about Trademark East Africa. We're a not-for-profit, and we've been working hard, as I said, for the last decade or more to really try to unlock trade potential in the East African community. We've recently increased our operations to now also include the Horn of Africa. We've just established operations there, and also increasingly in Southern Africa. We had the pleasure of signing a memorandum of understanding with the Continental Free Trade Agreement, the African CFTA, Secretariat in Ghana, I guess about 3 weeks ago in Lomé. So we're really excited to try to gear up our operations strategically to help the continent trade with itself. And I think that is really the opportunity of our time. You know, here in Africa, there's a lot of opportunity across the continent. And, you know, we need to do our best to, you know, really unlock that potential. The opportunity is massive. I think Africa has much more of an opportunity to trade with itself as a means for development, as opposed to relying just on external trade to the international environment. I think we all know the statistics that, you know, intra-Africa trade is much lower than other parts of the world. I know in the EU, more than 65%. I think, you know, we're in the East African community, we're much higher in terms of intra-regional trade. But across Africa, it's less than 15%. So the potential to grow and add value and create jobs is massive. And the UN Economic Commission for Africa, you know, I think have done a lot of studies showing just how many millions of jobs could be created. So, you know, just to say there's a great opportunity there, and it's unshaping and unfolding in a way that could really empower our companies and our businesses to take advantage. I think, though, just setting the context a little bit, there are some quite, and what I'm really going to focus on today are some of the trade facilitation issues that stop potentially the Continental Free Trade Agreement being used and potentially offer some solutions. And I'd be very interested to get participants' views on that for a discussion. I mean, you know, just setting the context, we're coming out of a difficult period, quite a volatile period with the COVID pandemic. It's hit many of the global value chains quite hard. It's, you know, also affected our ability here in East Africa to, you know, trade. We saw disruptions in key value chains at the borders, for example. But I think there's a good opportunity to basically bounce back from that. I think particularly you asked me to talk today about agribusiness, and I think agribusiness offers a massive opportunity because it employs millions across the continent and in our region. And, you know, the potential for value addition in agribusiness is strong. Most of the tradables that we currently trade are mainly commodity-based, maize, wheat, to some extent horticultural items, but it's mainly primary commodities. We mainly obviously export commodities as well, such as tea, coffee, cocoa, and also in some regions, tobacco. But there's a lot of potential to add value to that agribusiness. And I think the challenge is really to bring in our informal businesses and the millions of farmers that don't have a structured way of trading into the trade network. I think the key issue, it's also worth raising just in terms of the CFTA, is that tariffs there's good progress on harmonizing tariffs. You know, the agreements are moving forward, and tariffs aren't really the issue. The issues, in my view, are much more around non-tariff barriers and just problems of getting products across borders. We face, at the moment, very high costs of transport. I don't know if folks on today's session are aware, but we have a massive tight supply-demand curve in the shipping markets. So moving goods out by sea is incredibly expensive because of the shortage of containers at the present time. In some ways, that's good news because of the pickup post-COVID, but it does mean exporting internationally is very expensive. But, you know, saying that, as a region in East Africa, we've made massive progress. I mean, when I started Trademark, I think if you were trying to import a container to Kigali, for example, a landlocked country, obviously in East Africa, you'd be talking about spending more than $5,000 per container. That came down massively to around sort of 2,000. But of course, the current situation is a big issue. I think when you look at the Continental Free Trade Agreement, there are still big problems with cross-border operations and logistics. All right, we have in East Africa, things operate easier, but I was over in West Africa where basically trucks can be stuck at borders for more than 2 weeks. Some borders are still closed because of the COVID issues. And there are massive problems with standards in terms of being able to export, particularly agricultural commodities. The other challenge we face, as I said earlier, is quite a lot of our trade is informal. And it's not fully formalized. There's low values of value addition. And the key problem for many of our agricultural value chains is really the first mile challenge of getting products out to markets from the farm gate. The logistics system doesn't often operate in the way that's conducive for particularly producers and farmers. We then face quite big issues with last mile challenges as well in terms of the logistics chain. And if we're wanting to add more value and production and processing to our agribusiness, there's also issues with, for example, the cost of power. There's a lack of service land, and trade finance is still quite a big issue. So this often leads to quite fragmented value chains. And because of standards aren't harmonized across the continent, that's still work in progress in terms of the rules of origin and the local value addition. These are challenges that we need to look at. And I'm mainly focusing there on really some of the trade facilitation problems. And I mean, just to give you an example, I was over in West Africa a few weeks ago, trying to move day-old chicks across the borders from Cote d'Ivoire to Ghana. Basically, the delays and the border controls are so severe that actually all of the day-old chicks in the consignment I saw died, and it just wasn't possible. So these are some of the real issues on the ground, I think, that businesses face. And I thought it was quite telling that Dangote wrote an article, I think, a few weeks ago, just really highlighting those challenges. So, you know, great opportunity with the Continental Free Trade Agreement. Could unlock trade right across the continent, and particularly, you know, we also got to recognize that some of the fastest growing cities globally will be in Africa over the next 20 years, according to the UN Habitat. And the demand for agribusiness and horticultural products will really rise considerably. So what are some of the issues that could address these constraints? Well, I mean, we've taken with our partners, the government of Kenya, and great to have the government on the conference call this morning. You know, there's a massive opportunity in trying to look at unlocking, particularly the main trade arteries or trade corridors, as we call them. And you know, in our region in East Africa, we have the Northern Corridor, the Central Corridor. But there are big opportunities to reduce the time and cost of trade and improve logistics. And some of the ways of unlocking that have worked well in the EAC that I think personally now need to be adopted across the continent is the introduction of, for example, one-stop border posts, where goods basically just stop once, they don't stop twice. And with good risk management and digitization of trade processes, which I'll talk about a wee bit later, you can really reduce the time through these borders to make trade viable. And when you do that, you also open up the potential for regional value chain development, which is really important. So I'll give you an example. We've worked to support our partners on now about 18 or 19 border posts, where the average time by remodeling the physical infrastructure and also digitizing the trade processes has actually helped to reduce the time through the borders by 70%. And it's interesting when you go, when I went to Busia, the border between Kenya and Uganda, just before the pandemic hit, it was really interesting to see that actually what had also happened was a blossoming of informal trade, because many of the officials on both sides of the borders recognized just how important that informal trade is. And we were working hard with KRA and URA in that instance to try to bring in what we call a simplified trade regime that allowed small goods below the de minimis to travel to come across the border without any stops at all. And when I talked to the KRA station manager of Busia a while back, I heard that the revenues had gone up by, I think, about 3 or 4 times in a period of 3 years. The time through the borders had fallen 70%. The kind of harassment that a lot of those traders faced basically reduced by about 70%, because there was also a perception that informal trade is smuggling. But actually, when we did studies, we actually found that they were massively pro revenue generation. So that kind of win-win for the small traders through the one-stop border development is something that I think we need to really carry that mantra forward across the continent, because while we have much better borders, they're not perfect. In many parts of other parts of the continent, they're really a lot more dysfunctional. So if you're trying to move goods across the continent, that's a major constraint. And I just kind of raised that. But the way to solve it is through rethinking borders, not to be really major trade barriers, but trade facilitators. And I think that's an important issue. I think the second big issue is really that in agribusiness, particularly of standards. And there's a massive need to try to harmonize and mutually recognize standards, particularly phytosanitary standards, to improve traceability and to address poor quality of agricultural goods. And that, I think, can be heavily embedded in value chains by taking an approach of embedding standards adherence into horticultural and agricultural value chains. There's a good way of thinking about that structured trade through also creating opportunities for logistics platforms that bring together agricultural production to basically standardize and bulk up and to aggregate. We're developing a project at the moment, again at Busia, just use that example, where a lot of smallholder agricultural production will be aggregated up, standardized, and then sent out at much higher prices. So that basically farmers win, but then consumers win in terms of products that they can trust. So that standards issue is important, and the traceability, and trying to reduce the frictions in the trade system related to that. As I said, trying to think about logistics hubs to help with that, particularly logistics hubs outside of the major capitals, where agricultural produce kind of accretes or aggregates. And I think we're working on a couple of projects as trademark, one at Busia, another one in Gulu in northern Uganda, which are aiming to undertake those. If they work well, there'll be a lot more in terms of scaling up that approach. I think the other area is obviously the issue of eliminating non-tariff barriers. Non-tariff barriers are very pernicious. They are very adaptive. And basically, we need to strengthen, I think, the kind of non-tariff barrier identification and removal. That will mean the Secretariat in Ghana, but also the EAC and other RECs need to really, I think, step up the legislative framework for non-tariff barrier removal and, basically settling of trade grievances. And there's more work to do in my view, but it's easily done well, not easily done, but it can be done, to look at that and also think about how we can harmonize more in terms of trade policy. I think the other big issue is digitization. We've certainly found over the last decade that if you work hard to digitize trade processes, that can reduce, again, the transaction costs, because for a lot of agricultural producers, it's very hard to export because of all the different requirements. If you can put them online, digitize them, make them easier, that means that smaller businesses, cooperatives, can basically engage in international trade much more. We're seeing the development of also all sorts of different portals for pricing, the potential for anchor firms to work with farmers in the value chain is very strong. Digital platforms offer a good solution to link a farmer with basically an end market. And we're beginning to see the emergence of commodity exchanges that can help in that can also then bring in finance solutions. And I think the digital realm, we're very good at that here in Kenya. There's a lot of fantastic digital innovation. Applying that to some of the different SME and agribusiness value chains, I think could really add a lot. And finally, I guess, well, a couple of last things to say. We're thinking increasingly, how can you get that sort of first mile, last mile link in logistics better? And there we're really thinking about how we can de-risk basically logistics operations to help better access for smaller producers and for SMEs. And there are various innovations there that I think offer a lot of potential. And thinking then about a market systems approach to trying to make sure that the buyers and sellers in markets are more efficient, that the farmers actually get higher prices is really, really important. So let me maybe draw my points to a conclusion, is that I guess the CFTA offers a great opportunity, and that opportunity can be realized if we particularly look at some of the trade frictions, particularly in trade facilitation, through one-stop border development, digitization, proper integration of standards into agricultural value chains early on in the production cycle, thinking about how we can improve logistics for that first mile, last mile problem, and then obviously thinking hard about the information of markets. I mean, we haven't talked about the information asymmetry, and there again, the emergence of various mechanisms. For example, I mean, in Tanzania, we've been working on the TMX initiative, which is linking agribusiness producers to end markets, and commodity chain exchanges could really help in that respect. So with that, just to say, I think the opportunity is great. Although many of these kind of constraints or barriers seem insurmountable, with effort over periods of time, they can be unlocked. And it's great to see just how much has changed in our trade systems. We don't often recognize that, but certainly since we started trademark, for example, we've seen the costs of moving goods fall by about 30–40%. Now that has been there's been an issue with COVID that's raised those costs, but they're still very much below what they were a decade ago. That sort of reform should reform momentum and focus on improving the way that trade occurs across the continent is the way, in my view, to unlock the trade potential of the CFTA, particularly for agribusiness, where we know aggregate demand across the continent could really help millions and millions of people and millions of agricultural producers. So I hope that's quite what you wanted, and I'll stop there, but thank you again for inviting me. I really appreciate the chance to talk to you today, and very keen to get the discussion going. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank, for that background. I think you've raised a lot of pertinent issues trying to situate trade within the region. And we'll wait first to hear the reactions from Dr. Njenga, and then we'll invite Ambassador P.S. Keremi Kaberia also to give his keynote, and then we can field questions from the delegates and also from the panelists. In the chat feature, if you've got any questions, we can use those when we get into the discussion portion. Over to you, Dr. Njenga, to curate that first part of the conversation and also invite Honorable PS, Ambassador, to engage us.
Thank you so much, Frank. I was just wondering what you felt when those chicks died when you're crossing the border from Cote d'Ivoire to Ghana, is it? How often, or what do you feel most of the African leaders, especially at the political level, understand the issues you have raised? Is it that they're ignorant, or is it that they're incapable of transforming the barriers into support systems for trade? This is a question that always bothers me, because when political leaders are engineered to sort out a problem because they see how positive it is, they tend to support it. But it seems they are not doing so at the rate in which we want. Now, the second question obviously would be, can we copy phytosanitary standards, traceability, from, say, Europe or Asia, because we don't need to reinvent the wheel? Thank you, Frank. And with that, I finish my comment. And if you will answer that, then I will introduce P.S. Kaberia, my colleague. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, thanks. Those are really great questions. And I think those are really, you know, the question you ask about politics, I think, is the key one. I guess reflecting on where we started a decade ago here in East Africa, there were a lot of concerns by states, by opening up, would they see revenue losses? You know, would there be massive drops in revenue in terms of opening up markets? And if you remember, when we created a customs union here in East Africa, and I've been here now almost 16 years, there are a lot of concerns in certain parts of East Africa about that revenue loss. I remember also when Rwanda and Burundi joined, they were really concerned about being swamped and that their production would fall, you know. And I think what really transpired was quite a good political settlement where, if you remember, when the customs union came in, there was protection against Kenya as being the strongest economy that came down on a kind of sliding scale. And that created a lot of confidence. And I think the other thing that really happened was that countries recognized they wouldn't see massive revenue losses. And particularly from the formalization of trade, that actually also bore out and bore fruit. That gave a lot more political confidence to our leaders to take the step in, you know, opening up their economies more. Now, it's not perfect, and there have been issues, and we all know them. But what's interesting, when I went to Lomé, there was a really interesting discussion with all the trade ministers along what they call the Lagos-Abidjan corridor. So that is Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, Togo, Benin, and Nigeria. Now, what's really interesting, when I was listening to the discourse they were having, it was really reminding me of the discourses we had 10 years ago in East Africa. And I think you're right. Actually, that discourse and the concern about revenue loss, the concern, you know, sometimes misplaced by businesses that they need to protect their markets, you know, was overcome here in East Africa. And frankly, I think that political debate is still a live debate. And that's really the heart of the problem. I think we really need to have that debate in certain parts of the continent where that sort of understanding that actually trade lifts many boats, even as small economies, you can really benefit. I mean, look at the way that, for example, Rwanda has benefited from the EAC. So quite right. I think that debate needs to be brought on. And I mean, when I met with the Secretary General of the CFTA Secretariat, these are some of the live issues that I think now need to be sponsored. Those discussions need to happen. And often it's at a sub-regional rather than a fully continental level. So, one of the things I think that came out of that meeting, interesting enough, with the five trade ministers, was a need to start engaging with those discussions in an honest and open way. Because let's face it, the CFTA does have winners and losers. There will be adjustment costs. And I think what is quite gratifying is the way that there's actually a development of a kind of compensation mechanism. And I think that's really important. You're not going to open up trade across the continent without those political discourses taking place. And I mean, you'll know well, when I remember when we started Trademark all that time ago, these discourses were, difficult ones. When we talked about, for example, do you remember the EAC, the revenue sharing formula? There was a massive problem. But once we began to dig down into it analytically, the problem went away, and it was interesting. So I think, we just need to face those issues head on. We need to analyze and be honest about that. And, I think then the political will follow. And it took, I think, a good 3 or 4 years for us as a region to address those problems. The second thing I would say is it does require, what's the word for it? Yeah, it does require maybe a wider mindset that, we've seen a trend globally towards more national focused policies. We've seen a trend of globalization to fall apart a bit. And I personally do think we need to think about this opportunity of the CFTA, not through a national lens, but through a much more regional and continental lens. And that does mean that some of our policies need to think more regionally. Not everyone can produce the same products. Not everybody can, for example, most industrial policies look to develop garments and textiles, but frankly, the geographic division of labor needs to overcome that. So I think, that's the other big political hurdle, I personally think. Let's stop thinking so much nationally and start thinking outwardly to one African market. And that does require a mindset change from putting in place quite heavy barriers, be they non-tariff or standards barriers, to a wider market opportunity. And I think our businesses in Kenya are ready for that. We're quite mature here. We see the potential, and that sort of mindset of our leaders needs to bring some of our other political friends across the continent on board. So I'm afraid Rome wasn't built in a day, or certainly Nairobi wasn't. And it is work in progress. But I think you're right to raise those political challenges. But there's ways of dealing with that. And I personally remain an optimist about it. But we do, the good thing is our leaders recognize that, all right? Okay, I hope that answers your question, but it's a tough one, that one, because it does require quite a lot of concerted effort, and it will take time. I mean, for these things to be overcome will take time. Okay. And then I didn't mean to go on too much there, but that's an important question you ask, because really it is the most important question. In terms of SPS and traceability, we can copy from others, you're right. There's a lot of good thinking out there on the international shelf. We also need to think hard about what we're trying to achieve. If we're thinking about harmonizing standards with ourselves, those standards also need to be compatible with international standards. So the classic development strategy of accessing your local or regional markets across the continent as a way of also building competitiveness is something to really think about. So I personally think when it comes to that issue, keeping in mind harmonization, drawing from others, but also thinking hard about how we can actually meet those international standards too, I think it's a very strategic point, I hope that answers your question. I mean, one of the things we're working on at Trademark, which is an interesting question, is a digital traceability platform where we try to reduce the kind of trade frictions around SPS through mutual recognition, harmonization, but then trying to digitize a lot of that. So what does that mean? It means, for example, that on a blockchain, you can put down all the pesticide uses, the certificates, on a blockchain, they're visible, and that creates confidence. And, you know, one of the issues as well is certificates of origin, as you well know, you know, trying to digitize those so they can't be faked, because it's a major problem for customs across the continent. So I think digital can play a role there too. Let's take what we can from the international shelf of best practice, but let's also innovate ourselves. And be mindful that some parts of the continent use standards as a major trade barrier, because tariffs aren't really the big issue, I don't think, anymore. The big issue are NTBs and standards. So the more we can do to reduce those trade frictions, the better. It's a very important investment that we make. And if we can embed those from production all the way through to delivery, I think we could be onto a winner. Hope that answers it.
Beautifully, but we have to conclude something from what you have said. And one of the things that I feel we should conclude is that digitization is a platform and a tool that is necessary, and its integration in such a way, just like a car passes from Uganda to Kenya, we can have a remodeling of the transit routes between borders in such a way that once a certificate is given at the border, then there should not be any stop gaps along the way until goods reach there. Now, I think that's the biggest job we can do right now, which is to change the border point in such a way that all the needs are digitized and are there. The post and the certificate of goods transportation is given right there. Let me leave it there and say I really loved your presentation. It was right on point, Frank. Thank you very much.
Thanks, that's a pleasure. Really appreciate it.